Welcome to Divcasts from University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jawad Qureshi. I'm a PhD candidate in the Islamic Studies program here at the Divinity School. Right now, we've got Professor William Schweiker presenting the next paper. Professor Schweiker is the Edward L. Ryerson Distinguished Service Professor of Theological Ethics at the University of Chicago and Director of the Marty Center for the Advanced Study of Religion at the Divinity School. His talk this afternoon is titled God and the Human Good. Please join me in welcoming Professor Schweiker.
Okay. Well, I want to begin by thanking the organizers of this conference, Joshua Daniel and Miriam Renaud, for the invitation to speak at an event dedicated to one of the most profound and far-reaching questions in the religious and moral life. It's also an honor for me to share this podium with the renowned scholars gathered for this conference, and I especially want to thank my respondent, Jawad, for his comments later. Finally, thank you all for attending today. In what follows, I present an account of the relationship between God and the highest human good by drawing on philosophical and Christian theological resources. However, my basic task also includes addressing from within those resources what I see as major challenges to the religious life and particularly the Abrahamic religions. The challenges are, on the one hand, what is sometimes called practical atheism, and on the other, hyper-moralistic religion, too often being expressed in violent ways. These two interrelated challenges, I believe, demand a response from within the world's religions, and this lecture is my attempt to do so from within Christian sources. Other thinkers will have to do the same for their traditions. The challenges in hand, in a moment, I want to turn to offer a response to them, and I'm going to do so by drawing on two modern thinkers, one of which has already been explored in this conference, that is Immanuel Kant, but also John Wesley. These two figures have helped to shape, but not to determine, the form of my own theological ethics. The lecture today gives me the opportunity to wrestle with their thought in order to explore the meaning of our lives as moral beings, as moral agents. I conclude by returning to the challenges that provoke these reflections. Let me begin now by gaining some clarity on the theological and ethical focus of the argument. The orienting question of this conference is the relation, if any, between accounts of God and ethical possibilities. This topic is as debated around the world as it is broad. In the history of Western thought, the relation of God to what is morally right, just, and good has been a flashpoint among thinkers within as well as between the religions. The debate carries on. In our time, it has taken on global reach and too often lethal force. The global scene is alive, maybe ablaze, with our question, and it is thereby part of the public responsibility of thinkers to address it. My reflections will unfold at the intersection of moral philosophy and Christian theology. These two disciplines intersect, for the sake of this lecture, both in their examination of human life and in their reflection on the human highest good and human perfection. The claim that the highest good requires human perfection is long-standing in Western thought. Plato imagined a journey of the soul to God and the good. Thomas Aquinas taught that the beatific vision was the elevation and perfection of the soul through the infusion of the theological virtues of hope, faith, and love. Certainly in Orthodox Christian thought, the idea of theosis is a conception of human perfection. And there has also been, as we'll see, modern philosophers and theologians who advance their own distinctive claims about the highest good and human perfection. That being said, the idea of the highest good is nowadays often seen to entail a comprehensive doctrine, in John Rawls' term, and thus is supposedly to be bracketed from reflections on justice within liberal democracies. As for the idea of perfection, it is roundly criticized in our day as part of the modern rage for order, as Charles Taylor would put it, the imposition, as feminist and liberation theologians note, of a conception of the ideal man on others while claiming to be universal. And also, perfection too often entails the denial, as our own late Jean Bethke Elshtain would put it, a denial of the more quotidian features of our lives in all their messiness. Finally, in a highly consumerist culture, the belief that the human good would demand something of human beings, and so would require a transformation in our lives, is certainly against the spirit of the age, a consumerist age. Mindful of these worries about the idea of perfection, many of which I share, I want nevertheless to explore how the human highest good exposes an antinomy in human life, but is also an ethical possibility for thinking about human perfection and the living God. But given my focus on the link between the highest good and perfection, what is the distinctly theological focus of this lecture? Typically, claims about God and the human good have been addressed along intersecting lines of thought. God as the source of the human good and the source of the right. God as the supreme end of the moral life. God as the guarantor of the human good, and God as enabling and empowering a good and righteous life. Each of these conceptions of the relation between God and the right and the good can be found in the history of thought, as well as combinations of the different accounts. In Christian theology, these ideas about God's relation to the human good are often articulated in Trinitarian terms. God the Father is the source of created goodness and is pure righteousness. God the Spirit empowers a life of goodness and righteousness. God the Son is the divine promise and guarantee that the highest good, God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven, to use the language of prayer. Further, the plenitude of the divine being pours forth in creation, the fons bonorum, the fountain of goodness. A genuine theological ethics thereby relates the divine to the human good in and through the many dimensions of the moral life, and conversely, the moral life becomes a prism for the perception and experience of the divine here and now. Given the complexity of a theological account of the highest good, ethics needs to account for the demands of the finite practical life. In this light, what we are exploring in ideas about the highest good have certain parallels to the conception of religion when it is understood as the transformation of indeterminate complexity into determinate complexity, as the social theorist Nicholas Luhmann would put it. That is, every social system must respond to a wide array of possibilities and limitations found in its environment, and make some selections among them in order to actualize any of them. Each selection is an exclusion of possibilities, but also the inclusion of some of them into social life. While Luhmann limits the account to the social function of religion, I want to exploit its meaning for theological ethics. We are looking at human moral agents in relationship to God, others, and their environments, who must make decisions among competing goods due to the limitations of finite life. That is, we are going to see how an appeal to a God enables a thinker, Kant, Wesley, myself, to transform the wild diversity of ways of thinking about happiness and the equally complex array of moral norms into a determinate, ordered complexity in the conception of the highest good that human beings are capable of attaining. This transformation of complexity not only discloses the contribution of religious thinking to the moral life, it also provokes, I contend, reflection on the fundamental dimension of ethics, namely to articulate what it means to be an agent with others and in the world. To act at all, to orient one's life, is to bring into being through action a determinate complexity in one's own life, that of others, and the world. In this way, the moral life becomes the living interpretation of the meaning of our existence as agents. Further, in different ways, Kant and Wesley demonstrate the practical need for God in the conduct of life. Stated in that way, theological and ethical reflection on the human highest good and perfection allows us to connect a social world and our lives as agents under a normative theological and ethical perspective. Now, insofar as I'm talking about theological ethics, the relation between God and the human good is approached practically, rather than, say, speculatively or sociologically. The theological relevant problem is not the speculative denial of the being of God, or some idea of the secularization of modern differentiated societies. The problem is the denial that God cares about virtue and righteousness, and thus defines and sustains the moral space of life. Sometimes called practical atheism, the conviction, viewed objectively, is that God is not involved in the lives of human beings as moral agents. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once put this from the perspective of a moral agent, and there are two kinds of atheism. Atheism is the theory that there is no God. Now, one kind is a theoretical kind where somebody just sits down and starts thinking about it, and they come to the conclusion that there is no God. The other kind is practical atheism, and that kind goes out of living as if there is no God. And there are a lot of people who affirm the existence of God with their lips, and they deny his existence with their lives. No matter what the speculative arguments can be made or sociological observations advanced, the force of this kind of atheism is that theistic claims are irrelevant for the conduct of our lives, and in fact, religious beliefs might be detrimental to living a good and virtuous life. One assumption backing this lecture is that practical atheism is now more widely spread than we want to admit, and often among religious people themselves. So if the problem I'm trying to address is the practical irrelevancy of God, and, we could add, the forms of violence seen in monotheistic convictions when they become hyper-moralistic, this defines the moral atmosphere of our age. And given this, a theologian interested in ethics, such as myself, must retrieve religious ideas and show their meaning for the actual orientation of life in ways that respect and enhance the integrity of life, our own and that of others. Now, the account of the highest good I want to develop here from Christian sources is a synthetic concept of the highest good, and thereby demarks a determinate complexity about human conduct and existence. That is, this conception of the highest good draws together and combines two more basic ideas that in themselves are indeterminate: righteousness and well-being, or in other terms, virtue and happiness, eudaimonia. As history and current experience shows, there are endless conceptions of happiness, Some think of it as utility and pleasure, while others imagine wealth and power, and still others self-sufficiency. And the same is true of virtue or righteousness. Some ground it in God's commands, others look to social conventions, and still others champion the individual conscience or preferences and interests. The idea of the highest human good, then, seeks to transform the complexity of beliefs about happiness and virtue into a determinate and thereby living practical form. I'm suggesting that the human highest good be conceived as the felicity of pure justice, where righteousness and happiness combine. The highest good is not to become godlike. It is not a supernatural elevation of the believer to the beatific vision. The conception here is also not a Platonic idea of the good. The conception I am setting out can be interpreted as a thoroughly human one, interrelated with a conception of the moral meaning of our being human beings. In this respect, it is more time-bound and finitude-bound than some other Christian and non-Christian conceptions of the highest good. The gain to theological ethical thinking, in my account, is that this interpretation is more determinate, or so I claim. We can now link the two sides of my argument. Theologically, I want to focus on the idea of God as the guarantor of the human highest good, meaning by that the guarantor of combining righteousness and happiness. Other ideas of God, say God is the source or end or empowerment of the human good, will have to be explored in another time. But for me, they would need to be explored within the framework I'm trying to develop in this lecture. Ethically, I want to focus on how the idea of the highest good entails a conception of human perfection. Importantly, there is a twist I want to put on the conceptions of Wesley and Kant, since both of them connect thinking about God with the highest good and claims about human perfection. In light of the seeming absence of God for many in our time of mass murder and also runaway violent religion, the twist in my argument is to show that God, conceived as the guarantor of the highest good, is not wantonly anthropocentric, but to the contrary, it is a way to respect and enhance our being finite creatures in our finitude, in our limitations. The ethical possibility in this account of God, I'm saying, is to keep human life thoroughly human, with the proviso that our responsibility for the integrity of human and non-human life is itself part of the human highest good as finite agents. The root question, then, is the worth of our finitude and how our practical lives are key to the answering of that question. In order for the highest good to have any practical meaning, it must present a determinate and yet complex and possible account of our being human with others on earth. The account of God that I am giving means that any conception of God, the highest good, or human perfection, that demeans or destroys the integrity of life is morally evil. Conversely, any idea of human perfection and the human highest good that elides respect for others and even love for human and non-human life is theologically invalid. Conversely, any idea of human perfection that elides this respect for human beings and their good is theologically valid, or we should actually add sinful. This is how I'm going to want to respond to the forms of practical atheism we see in our world, as well as the horrific expression of hyper-moralistic religions. So I turn next to explore perfection and the antinomy of the highest good in Kant and Wesley's thought. To use Wesley's terms, we are engaging men of reason and religion. Now, while I titled this lecture God and the Human Good, it should now be clear that the title is actually not quite correct. If I were to explore the human good in the full meaning of the idea, I would have to set out and unfold in detail a range of types of basic goods and the needs they answer. Elsewhere, I have called these types bodily, social, local, and reflective good, as well as identified various subtypes of each type. Exploring basic goods can be undertaken from a naturalistic perspective by trying to isolate and identify the needs that must be met for a living being to flourish in some manner rather than to diminish and eventually to die. Yet a focus on those types of basic goods alone would deflect from the argument I'm trying to make today, that is, to forward a conception of the highest good. We need, therefore, to include, along with basic goods, a conception of the distinctly moral good. Acts and agents are morally good when they respect and enhance the integrity of life, one's own and that of others as well. Moral goodness is to be understood in relation to basic goods about which we must make decisions and judgments needed for life to flourish in some way. But the moral good is not reducible to those basic goods because it is about agents and actions that respect and enhance the integration of those basic goods in one's own life and others. The moral good, then, is predicated of an agent in terms of the relation manifested in the agent's actions between who one is and one's conduct of life. This is why we need to speak of respecting and enhancing the integrity of life as reasons held by an agent for living in a specific way, that is, living morally. Insofar as the range of basic goods allows for an indeterminate complexity of ways of fashioning one's life, they need to be integrated morally, even though that too is a human possibility. The complexity of basic goods, in other words, does not determine the choice of which basic goods to endorse and realize. One might make social goods basic to the integrity of one's life. The ancients often made the reflective good, in the form of the contemplative life, basic to the integration of a human life. One might also see the integration of basic goods solely and simply for oneself or one's community, contrary to and even at the expense of others. To be sure, there have been thinkers in the legacy of Western thought who held such a view, and generally speaking, those positions recognize that the increase of one's power is the necessary condition to one's flourishing. And this can include the domination of the weak by the strong, as Callicles puts it in Plato's Gorgias, or the striving for self-overcoming and the will to power, as Nietzsche put it, or even the rational surrender of the natural right to kill others in order to escape violent death, as Thomas Hobbes put it, that is, the war of each against each. Now, my task today is not to refute those counter-arguments to morality. However, we cannot leave out of our reflections, the question of power informing our ideas about basic goods, moral goods, and even the highest goods. At this point, we can say then that the highest good for human beings can be understood in relation to basic goods and the moral good, as well as the power to relate and integrate those. These ideas are meant to bring nuance to the older terminology of Wesleyan Kant, that is, the integrity of basic goods is to happiness what moral integrity is to virtue and righteousness. The highest good is the combining of basic and moral goods on the outlook we're going to be elucidating. The question will be about the kind of power and even whose power can integrate those goods and thus enact the human highest good. And here we can now start engaging Kant and Wesley. In the second part of the Critique of Practical Reason, Kant defines happiness, as we heard earlier this morning, but I want to explore a little bit further, as the unity of wish and will, the, quote, consciousness of the agreeableness of life as a whole, unquote. This is a rather complex conception of happiness. There are seemingly endless possibilities we can wish for, and maybe even be able to will them, from which that incredible complexity, we need to make some selection in order to orient our lives. And yet, wish and will taken together, if we see the two together, there is a reduction and a determination of that complexity. What can I realistically choose? What can I realistically bring about? Put in Kant's terms, happiness, as the unity of wish and will, entails choices with respect to a determinate range of possible choices. Happiness is when my wishes are achieved by my will, and correlatively, when my will is powerful enough to realize my wishes. We normally do not count someone happy whose wishes are unfilled due to weakness of will, bad luck, coercion, or the inability to select among good, say the Don Juan figure. Disappointment and frustration are features of finite human life, and they are characterized by a disproportion between wish and will. An increase of power as well as proper wishes seems to be the path to happiness as a kind of self-sufficiency in the face of the constraints of life. Little wonder then that the increase of power or the cessation of desire, that is of wish, have been major trajectories of thought about human happiness. Yet those approaches are neither as complex nor as determinate as the unity of wish and will. There must be, it would seem, some way of combining power and desire, will and wish, and that demand strikes us, as Kant puts it, as a fact of reason. For Wesley, the fact of reason does not define true happiness. Christianity, he writes, begins just where heathen morality ends, unquote. Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, teaches the art of happiness, but this art is a radical transformation of non-Christian morality. Heathen morality, as Wesley calls it, unfortunately, begins with a rational belief that God is, and that God rewards those who seek and glorify him along with the practice of virtue. But Christian faith, Wesley says, quote, is not barely a speculative, rational thing, cold, lifeless assent, a train of ideas in the head. No, it is a disposition of the heart, unquote. More pointedly, Christian faith, for Wesley, has a complex double structure. General faith is defined following Hebrew 11s as, quote, the evidence of things unseen, the assurance of things hoped for. The first glimmer of faith is an awakening to the spiritual depth and the scope of reality and existence. It is a form of Christian enlightenment. At a higher level, true Christian faith is, according to Wesley, saving faith. This imparted righteousness is, quote, the life of God in the soul, the mind which was in Christ Jesus, the image of God stamped upon the heart, now renewed after the likeness of him that created it, unquote. Given this, Christian happiness is not the combining of wish and will, but an inversion or transformation of these at the levels of affections and dispositions, which are, contrary to Kant, perceptions of the divine life animating one's own life. The power of combining happiness and holiness as the attributes of the highest good is not, as it was for Kant, the warrant for postulating God. It is rather the being and activity of the divine in one's own life as a moral agent. Like Christians throughout the ages, in other words, Wesley claims that God is not only the guarantor of the human good, but also its source, end, and empowerment. The art of happiness, taught by Christ in the Sermon on the Mount, focuses on humility, poverty of spirit, holy joy, patience and meekness. This divine temper, as Wesley calls it, of saving faith must abide and increase in one's life day by day. Now, the differences between Kant and Wesley are striking. Happiness is the unity of wish and will for Kant, but that is the self's felicity and the self's will. The power of combining wish and will is freedom as a postulate of practical reason of the transcendental conditions of human action. Wesley, making a more naturalistic and empirical argument, thinks that the power or will of the Christian life is the, quote, inner kingdom of God, unquote, along with the believer's affections and freedoms. Further, the Christian vision of happiness is a transformation of common morality expressed through the blessings and inversions of ideas about happiness in the Beatitude. Kant would hardly admit that meekness is a form of happiness, since that would be an inversion of self-power, and self-power is crucial for the unity of happiness and virtue. Yet it is crucial to see, before we turn from happiness to righteousness and virtue, that Kant and Wesley each seek to keep happiness human. They are not seeking a form of happiness beyond our ilk, but with respect to our existence as rational, free, feeling, willing agents. Now, the moral question in Wesley and Kant's minds focuses not on wish, but on will, or love, the motive force of distinctly moral action. For Kant, only the good will, a will whose maxims are formed by the objective practical law, deserves happiness. For only a good will deploys human power in respect for persons and in striving for the kingdom of ends, that is, a community of respect and justice. Kant formulates the supreme principle of morality, the categorical imperative, in terms of universalizability, respect for persons, and the kingdom of ends. For an action to be genuinely moral, it must be from duty, that is, taking the moral law as the maxims of one's actions and not simply acting out of duty. For Wesley, the supreme moral law is the double love command found in Matthew 22:36-40. I assume we all know this double love command. While Kant denied that love could be commanded, this is precisely Wesley's point. And in doing so, he opens up the possibility of obedience to the moral law to a wider, more complex range of emotions and dispositions than Kant would accept. This is also why, as we have seen, the Beatitudes are important, since they articulate the dispositions and the affections of the heart that can and should motivate the moral life. What Wesley thinks is the moral law, Kant would, of course, contend, is a merely hypothetical imperative grounded ultimately in self-love. Yet Wesley's point is that the witness of God's Spirit within one's own spirit does not deny freedom, but is the true condition and possibility of freedom. So Kant and Wesley here are wrestling with a very old problem. What we are trying to get at is the relation between righteousness, that is, acting on the right maxim or sentiment or disposition, along with the integration of basic goods so that life might flourish, have some measure of happiness. The unity of these, I have said, is for Wesley and Kant the highest human good, correlate to a new form of existence, namely perfection or virtue or moral integrity. And we are now asking how, if at all, God should be understood and worshiped as the guarantor of precisely that idea of the human highest good. Notice further that this entails a conception of human existence as the interaction or even struggle between two seemingly incompatible laws. That is, the demands of morality and the demands to meet basic needs and goods to flourish. The antinomy is between happiness and virtue that actually articulates the core of our being as moral agents. It was Kant, of course, who used the term antinomy in his critique, although, as noted just now and explored further in a moment, he was not alone in doing so. Kant is even so bold to claim that, quote, it is an a priori necessity to produce the highest good through the freedom of the will. The highest good as a synthesis of happiness and virtue is the necessary object of a free will, and further, this means, socially, a conception of the kingdom of ends as the point of our social life that can also function as a regulative ideal for judgments about our current social life. Now, the task of the analytic of the Critique of Practical Reason was to establish the supreme principle of morality, the categorical imperative, that warrants the postulate of freedom as the transcendental condition of the possibility of acting morally. Yet it is the synthetic idea of the highest good, Kant holds, that justifies the postulates of immortality and God. Immortality is the postulate of endless time in which we can and must make ourselves worthy to be happy. That is, to combine wish and will under the moral law, to act from duty and not just out of duty. And God, or better put, the idea of God, the reality of which exceeds our powers of knowing, is nevertheless rightly postulated as an all-knowing and all-powerful judge who sustains the perfect justice of the moral order, that is, rewards virtue with happiness and inversely punishes the wicked. It is here, Kant tells us, that practical reason is conceived of as extending pure reason while remaining within rational limits. So the warrant for the postulate of God and immortality is purely practical and in service of the highest good, the combining of virtue and happiness, and the social good as well, the kingdom of ends, the struggle for eternal peace. The human highest good is the triumph over the struggle of life into a different modality of existence in perfection. Call it the holy will. For us who exist in time as sensible and moral free creatures, the possibility is, as he puts it in the groundwork, of the good will. Religious ideas, God and immortality, are essential then, on my reading of Kant, to the transformation of indeterminate complexity found in common sense ideas about happiness and duty into a determinate complexity. That is the moral law, which ought to be the test of all moral actions. By testing one's maxims, by the moral law, the indeterminate possibilities of seeking happiness and duty are rendered determinate with respect to the selection of courses of action. Religion is the form of the ideas of God and immortality and is essential for the transformation of complexity in a way that is morally praiseworthy. This is why we can see Kant defines religion as acting as if all one's duties are commands from God. God is not the source of the good or the right. God is the guarantor of the highest good. Kant's conception of the highest good in relation to the divine is, importantly, a way of keeping human life human. That is, a way to confront the tensions and complexities in finite human temporal existence. It is, I'm claiming, a need of human beings rightly to integrate their lives and thereby give rise to a higher self, a virtuous person on the way to perfection. Wesley's idea of perfection is, again, similar and yet very different. In a plain account of Christian perfection, he writes, perfection is, quote, a renewal of the heart in the whole image of God, the full likeness of him that created it. And yet, in another sense, it is the loving of God with all one's heart and one's neighbor as oneself. For Wesley, perfection is another name for holiness. That is, the complete love of God and love of neighbor as well as oneself. There are stages to the Christian life, a going on to perfection, as he likes to put it. The highest form is to be born from above, and so born of God and thus renewed in one's created nature. By the power of the divine Spirit, one is freed from the necessity of sin, that is, freed from the temptation to despise God and to hate one's neighbor, freed from evil thoughts and tempers. This perfection and the law of love are not, in Kant's terms, heteronymous. God's actions and presence in the believer's heart does not countervene freedom. It restores and vivifies human freedom. It is closer to what later theologians would call theonomy. Yet Wesley's thought holds out the possibility of perfection in this life, and like Kant, finds a necessary place for human eudaimonia, human happiness. Here, too, we see that the human need for the divine in order to integrate life, since if I read him rightly, for Wesley, God is the power of fully integrated existence, the combining of basic goods with the moral good. Notice, too, that Wesley holds that a holy temper, the power of God abiding in oneself through faith and lived in love, is oriented towards the restoration of one's created finite nature. Insofar as that is the case, then the highest good is not contrary to finite existence, but rather is the transformation of human existence into the embodiment of its loves. This is heart religion, as he calls it, true scriptural experimental religion, the way to heaven, as he puts it. Importantly, the highest good is not delayed until heaven, nor is heaven a denial of our humanity. The first step is to awaken to one's condition, and the Christian life then is a growth in grace that is ever moving towards greater and greater life. Wesley would see Kant as an almost Christian, someone with a profound vision of the height and glory of, quote, heathen morality, unquote. True religion for Wesley is a transformation of indeterminate into determinate complexity in order to orient life in and not against the world or our humanity. It is found in personal holiness and also necessarily social holiness and the demand to transform human community to embody happiness and holiness, a state that remains an eschatological hope. Now that conclusion brings me back to my point of departure. That is, the ethical possibilities of theological and religious claims in an age of practical atheism. I conclude then with some reflections on this point. The argument I've presented today has several dimensions. First, I have tried to explore the topic of this conference in relation to the contemporary scene where practical atheism and violent hyper-moralistic religions seem to stalk the public ways of our world. This required that I engage the conference topic practically, that is, with respect to our being moral agents. Second, I focused on accounts of God as the guarantor of the highest good, but I've done so in a way that the divine good does not trump the human good or the good of other forms of life. The human highest good is therefore bound to the responsibility persons and communities exercise to respect and enhance the integrity of life, both human and non-human. In making that argument, I have suggested, but not dwelt on, we need revisions in a Kantian or Wesleyan position, revisions that center on the interrelation of types of goods and the moral imperative to respect and enhance the integrity of life. Third, I have shown us that a specific ethical argument appeals to the idea of God, in Kant's case, or the living presence of God, as Wesley holds, in order to render determinate the indeterminate complexity that besets human life about what would bring happiness and what is morally demanded of us. Their way of doing so, I've tried to suggest, sought to protect the human good from either religious fanaticism or practical atheism. I have not tried to equate Wesley and Kant, but rather to isolate analogies between them by presenting an argument that is at once both philosophical and theological in terms. Behind that strategy is a deeper and more complex claim that has informed my argument. My intention has been to think within a certain conception of Christianity. Kant and Wesley, in their different ways, articulate the relationship between eudaimonistic ethics, that owes its origins to Hellenistic forms of moral philosophy, with a more prophetic biblical emphasis upon God's commands, duties, and justice. In this light, Christian faith itself is a synthetic reality that gave rise to what Paul Ricoeur once called the third man, that is, the Christian as a believing Gentile. This is, I think, the ethical possibility of Christian faith. To borrow from St. Paul, a Christian is neither Jew nor Greek because, we can say, one is both Jew and Greek. Elsewhere, I have called this theological humanism. In this lecture, I'm trying to enact it rather than to rehearse the argument, but I have done so through the use of the analogical imagination, as David Tracy has called it. What then can we conclude from the argument of this lecture? I've tried to unfold in several steps a basic human need for God that arises within our practical lives. That is, the need to render determinate the complexity of the integrity of our lives, which is the human highest good. The practical human need can be articulated philosophically in ways argued by Kant and answered with the postulates of God and immortality. It can be given Christian form in ways developed by Wesley in terms of divine power to combine happiness and holiness. By shifting the focus of God talk from God as the source or end of the good and the right to that of God as the guarantor of the human highest good, not only is the good humanized, as it were, but so too is religion. And given the interpretation of the relation between the highest good and human perfection, this commits believers and non-believers alike, who accept my argument, to a way of life that respects and enhances rather than demeans and destroys the integrity of finite existence. This allows us, I suggest, to diffuse forms of practical atheism and its lately born and violent sibling of hyper-moralistic religions. In sum, I have tried today to meet the demand noted at the outset of this lecture. The global scene, I noted, is alive, maybe ablaze with the question of this conference, and it is thereby part of the public responsibility of thinkers to address it. Thank you very much.
All right, so I have a few set of observations, and then we can open up for questions and discussion. So first, I'd like to thank Professor Schweiker for this provocative set of meditations on the meaning of our humanity as ethical agents in relation to God. I'd like to summarize the general structure of the argument presented and offer some of my reflections before we open the floor to discussion. So the provocation for this paper rests on what is presented as perhaps the most pressing challenge to religions today, practical atheism. Practical atheism here refers not to secularism or the mere denial of the existence of God, but refers to a mode of ethical being that assumes that God is not concerned about virtue or righteousness. Conceived in this manner, it extends not only to secular or even explicitly atheistic modes of thinking, but also to self-professed theists. Three reasons were given for the proliferation of practical atheism: the scale and nature of violence in the 20th century, the traditionally anthropocentric view of the cosmos and the good being dislodged by a vision of the cosmos and the good that no longer centers on humanity, and thirdly, the proliferation of hyper-moralistic forms of religion that are often expressed in violence. So given the various philosophical and theological resources available to respond to practical atheism, the structure of the argument draws on a move from the social theorist Niklas Luhmann, who argues that every social system must respond to an array of possibilities by making some selection from the variety of resources available to it, moving from indeterminate possible options to determinate ones in order to actualize any of them. So thus the paper structurally draws on two thinkers, Kant and Wesley, and represents as representatives of traditions of moral philosophy and Christian theology. Specifically, it looks at these two traditions and these two figures at their intersection on the question of human life, the human highest good, and human perfection. So I won't get into much of the conversation on Kant and Wesley, and I'll leave that for the discussions here. But there were a few things that came to my mind as I was reading through this. The first relates to this notion of practical atheism. This is, I think, an extremely useful heuristic for studying and thinking about religion today, and that it offers a good deal more utility than many of the discussions emanating from the social sciences related to secularism. Rather than focus on the questions of belief, practical atheism as a concept draws attention to how moral agents think and actually carry themselves. The anthropologist Talal Essed, in an essay in which he engages some of the salient arguments of Charles Taylor's A Secular Age, complicates the centrality of belief to religion. Furthering Taylor's observation, Essed argues that a secular age is not merely one where the choice between belief and unbelief are equal, with the deck stacked in favor of unbelief, but rather, Essed observes that in a secular age, the ways in which avowedly religious and avowedly secular people carry themselves and reason ethically are by and large the same. That is to say, without reference to God. Bodies and minds have been disciplined in particular ways such that they no longer reference religion or tradition. Essed seemed to be getting at the same point that this notion of practical atheism rests on, but didn't have this idea available to him when he was writing. My second observation relates to the question of how another tradition might go about responding to the challenge of practical atheism. As this paper noted, in responding to this challenge, each tradition would draw on the resources that are available to them. In doing so, the structure of each tradition's modes of ethical thinking will shape the nature of questions and how the investigation would proceed. Speaking from the tradition that I study, the Islamic tradition, the investigation would perhaps not draw on moral philosophy or theology, given that these two disciplines look quite different within Islamic thought, but the bulk of Islamic ethical reasoning would be derived from Islamic law and interpretations of the Islamic canon. Thus, this investigation would largely take the form of an ethico-legal discussion that is rooted in a hermeneutic of particular canonical texts. The Muslim ethicist today has their hands full. The Arab Spring has undone the intellectual grip that authoritarian states had on their citizenry for the better part of a century, and all of the factors that contribute to practical atheism discussed earlier, in particular hyper-moralistic religious worldview that manifests in violence, all these are rampant. The levels of violence related to religion today, in the Middle East today, are unprecedented in modern history. So briefly, it appears to me that there are three key ways that Muslim ethicists have sought to address the problem of practical atheism, all of which I feel fall short in some way or another. The first is a fundamentalist-like call to return to the sources of revelation. This, in fact, has been a key factor in the increase of hyper-moralistic worldview. In response to this, a second move was made by Muslim ethicists, namely to return to the authority of medieval schools of law and theology. This move might have quieted the fundamentalist fervor, but it remains unable to address the gulf between medieval modes of thinking and being and colonial and post-colonial modernity. Both of these visions treat Muslim ethics largely as deontological. But over the last century, there's been an appeal to bypass the particularity that fundamentalism and legalism entails by emphasizing what is termed as the higher principles of law, maqasid al-sharia. These are an inductive abstraction of what the lawgiver intended, an attempt to determine God's will. This set of discourses overlaps theology, ethics, and law, and it is in this latter set of discourses that Muslim ethicists are actively seeking to address the notion of the human good as it relates to today's challenges. Legal theorists have traditionally posited that the objective of the lawgiver in all the laws put forth is a preservation of 6 things: the preservation of religion, of human life, of honor, of lineage, the intellect, and property. And these constitute the human good as derived from the lawgiver. For Muslim ethicists, the challenges to religion that practical atheism highlight for us would largely extend discussions related to the preservation of religion and human life in terms of how various religious and non-religious individuals and communities relate to one another, and the discussions related to property in terms of how ethical Muslims would relate to the environment. This latter point has not been developed yet by Muslim ethicists, but the need for this is dire. So this vision of ethical thinking then remains anthropocentric, but God, through sacred law, remains the guarantor of the human good. This was one of the key things that came about when I was reading this. The structure of the thinking will be fundamentally different, but as I was reading through this, much of the language of Kant and Wesley was familiar, but it's placed structurally within Islamic thought in different places. So this notion of canonical thinking and legal thinking were the key points that came up to me. So my point here is simply to expand the paper's observation that in addressing the challenge that practical atheism poses, each tradition's structure of ethical thinking, its history, and its current reality will shape how it proceeds. And in the case of Islam, this will be largely in the sphere of legal theory. Okay. So these were just some short observations I had on the paper, and I'd like to open this up for any questions or discussion. If you want to come back up there.
Thank you for your usual profound address to a very important question. I always find myself instructed by the way you think. Well, thank you. My question has to do with this. From the perspectives of the traditions of any of the Abrahamic faiths or of Greco-Roman ethics, what is the role of sacrifice by human beings to God as a way of relating to or respecting God as guarantor and in pursuing the highest good?
Can you say what you mean by sacrifice?
Well, there's a plethora of examples, traditions of all of those faiths, and they're not all the same. But basically, I think it involves giving something in some way to God as an expression of one's faithfulness to this God.
Yeah, this is where, if we had more time, the 5 different types of goods. And this is where, if we had more time, the 5 basic types of goods becomes important for addressing evangelistic questions like this. That is, a person's life can be rightly and morally integrated as long as one's respecting and enhancing that life as well as others. This may mean, for instance, that a monk might give up certain sexual activities for the sake of integrating his life in relationship to God. Where one can imagine other kinds of orderings and sacrifices. The force of my position, however, is that if religious sacrifice would require the demeaning and destroying of the very power to integrate a life, it would be immoral. I do not think that one has a religious obligation to do such. But how one integrates and puts together a life in all of its complexity can be variously addressed in different religious communities. Different types of piety will do so in different ways. But since this is a position that is, quoted Wesley, to men of reason and religion, I have to be able to make an argument for the standards of making those judgments that don't immediately or solely appeal to the divine. Is that getting into the question? In that respect, we're always making sacrifices. We're all figuring out how to render our lives relatively coherent against the backdrop of many indeterminate possibilities.
Could you speak in particular about Kant, and would any understanding of quote-unquote sacrifice be meaningful to Kant in his?
Well, again, it depends, and John might be a better one on this, it depends on what you mean by sacrifice. Kant is quite clear that one's desires and affections need to be ordered under the moral law. I suppose you could say that's sacrificing. It all depends on what that term means and carries. Yes, Phil.
So, Bill, this is, so first a comment, then a quick question. So this is continuing a conversation we started last night and we'll continue to tomorrow morning. I might quibble a little bit with you with the implication that good implied in something like deification is not really about finitude. So I think, I mean, we'll continue tomorrow morning, but I think something like deification may see finitude as a problem, but not necessarily see it as something it's trying to negate or something in opposition. But my question, though, is when you talk about keeping happiness human, about the finite human life, about humanizing the good, do you mean strictly the human? And if so, I guess what makes me just think about grace in that sense. I guess behind your reflections, I'm seeing, I guess, the nature-grace problematic.
Well, I was trying to work analogically between two thinkers who have very different takes on grace and what is given, to see those as resources within my own tradition to try to address this kind of question. Right? So then we're into discussions about what we mean by grace, what we mean by nature. So one of my gambits is to switch the discourse, the primary categories, away from, say, being towards life, because I think two things. One, I think we are living in a time in which virtually all forms of life can be endangered through human action, and it's the responsibility of our generation of thinkers to address this. And I also think that one of the tasks of ethics is to protect the penultimate from being dominated by the ultimate. This may be back to Ron's question. I think one of the tasks of ethics is to protect those things that are finite and vulnerable to not only religious claims, but political, ideological claims that can run roughshod over the finiteness of our existence. Now that may mean a different conception of what one of the tasks of ethics are, but that's what I'm working from.
But I guess just very quickly, but isn't that the implication there that any discussion of the ultimate in some ways never really is about the penultimate? Does that make sense? I mean, I guess I guess what I'm hearing is that there is this kind of strict divide in some sense between the ultimate good and the penultimate.
Well, I try to suggest how the human highest good is related to the divine.
Yeah.
And that would be an ultimate.
As guarantor.
Right.
Right.
I'm also doing an interesting flip on the usual argument. Those who make strong arguments about theocentrism are always worried about anthropocentrism, human beings using God for their purposes. Mm-hmm. I'm doing it, taking what precisely might be seen as the most anthropocentric element, God guaranteeing our good, and to show that in fact that requires us to respect and enhance finite life. It's not anthropocentric.
I think that your countries must place an emphasis on sacrifice, because the picture that you have on your advertisement is a Caravaggio painting of Abraham trying to sacrifice his son and God stopping it. So maybe you want to say that God does not ask unnatural or impossible sacrifices, or that God does not demand sacrifices. Well, what would you say with that?
Well, first of all,
You have it on your
I didn't choose the poster. That's the first thing to know. And secondly, it would have to be case by case. I tried to show how I have the conceptual framework within which to work on this. As you know, this question of the sacrifice of Isaac is a passage that's bedeviled Jewish and Christian thinkers throughout the centuries. By saying that God is the guarantor of the human good and its finiteness, does imply that a religion that claims you ought to destroy finite existence has got problems. It's not theologically valid, which is one of my responses to Ron.
Yes. First of all, thank you very much, Professor Schweiker, for your paper, your offering here. And this sort of follows on Professor Coffey's comments. It seemed, as you were identifying, that as we find our perfection here in this world, or as we have that possibility here, that this is a humanizing of happiness, a humanizing of religion, that would indicate that theologies that locate a perfection or some form of perfection in the hereafter would be somehow anti-human. And maybe that's not the route that you're going.
All I've done is opened up a problem, which I've tried to address within my tradition, and then I must say to others, go and do likewise. But you may, and that's what I thought was so splendid about this response, may come up with some other understandings, other ways of formulating. I'm trying to give an intra-Christian / philosophical hermeneutic to understand how to use the resources of that tradition in a way that I think is defensible and plausible. But I can imagine someone such as doing this with a very different terminology, different ends, than a Christian.
So then the principle that we should be reducing from this is more specifically what you just said, the preservation of the ultimate, and identifying theologies that are using that perhaps as a metric for evaluating different theological claims, and not necessarily perhaps here the location of perfection or the identification of where grace is operating.
Yeah, if the Abrahamic religions want to say that creation is good, then one ought to be in service of protecting and promoting finite goodness.
So I have a Lutheran question, I think. So I understand the respect and integrity of life to sound something like second table duties of the law, but I'm unclear on how your paper would relate to the first table of the law, and basically what I'm interested in is what would it mean to love God on this account of God as a guarantor? Because God as a guarantor of morality sounds like God as judge, right? And is God also doing acts of forgiveness, or I guess I don't quite see how the first table is coming into the application.
Okay, well, I'll answer that with respect to another great Lutheran, that is St. Paul. and that is, what was very interesting in the later letters, and one sees this also in 1 John, the two great love commands are collapsed into one. Whoever does not love his brother cannot claim to be loving God. So I'm not starting with the distinction between first and second table. I'm talking about the integrity of life and its wholeness, which includes divine life. Right? And I think it's one of the remarkable things in the New Testament text that one moves to that. Let me quote another Lutheran, that is Jesus. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Which means that there's a complex transformation going on in those texts that I think continues the prophetic tradition.
I wonder if you could clarify something I thought you were saying about the Beatitudes. I think you said that, maybe this was on behalf of Wesley, I'm not sure, that Beatitudes are dispositions that motivate the moral life.
No, the Beatitudes signal when they say things like, blessed are the meek, then meekness becomes a good disposition to have manifested in his life.
Yeah,
and so what you have to...
Warning, I don't think, I thought it was like the Beatitudes eschatological reversals, part of the eschatological reversal literature, and so we think, okay, these are especially in Luke and the Magnificat, the people who are down and out are going to be the ones who have the goodies and the reversal and so forth. So I was.
This is the whole force of Wesley and myself not wanting to put off until the eschaton, the point at which something like neatness is morally viable.
And mourning? I mean,
I think
there are occasions for mourning, but I'm
Yeah.
just saying, I thought that maybe the Beatitude was looking at people who really have a lot to a kind of long-term posture. It's not just
Yeah,
happy,
yeah, one can interpret it that way, but Wesley is really quite astonishing. He thinks that the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus teaches the art of happiness. How to go about living a life that is fully alive. That doesn't gainsay there might be eschatological elements. It just means that he's trying to derive more. And I think this is one of there are a couple of other Christian thinkers do it, but it's really one of the distinctive things of the Methodist tradition. We don't take the Ten Commandments, we don't take some eschatological kingdom coming. We're taking this picture of the Christian life given in this epitome in Jesus' teaching. It's not looking at theological the history of virtues. It's a different way of entering what it means to do Christianity. John is good. Good.
So I'm reflecting on Kant on sacrifice.
Yeah.
I think I want to start with something you said that I thought wasn't quite right. You said that Kant denies that love can be combined. Right? But Kant makes a distinction between what he calls practical love and pathological love. Pathological love can't be commanded, it's just a feeling. But practical love can be commanded, and is commanded. He thinks of practical love as given expression in the categorical imperative.
Right, and all I was trying to get at is that Mr. Wesley would think that love is something other than the categorical imperative.
Yeah, but it's important. I mean, when we're tracing Kant through Kierkegaard, that love can be a command.
Well, I wasn't trying to interpret it through Kierkegaard.
But now, how does this get to sacrifice? I think when Kant says love is a command, he means there's something in us that has to be humiliated. What he calls inclination.
Well, that's how I responded.
Right, so that this...
Although I wouldn't use the term humiliation.
That's his...
Well, what happens to respect for oneself and humanity in one?
Yeah, so what happens in respect, actually, there are two moments. There's the moment of humiliation, and then there's the moment of exaltation. There's a negative moment and then a positive moment. The first moment is negative. And so there is a requirement in a Kantian moral for sacrifice.
That's good, thank you.
Is there backwards, probably knows, but is there a way to get today's lecture on the internet or to read it again?
Well, we're going to try, I assume, to publish these things. And I think they may be putting the filming of these online at some point. Sure.
Could you enhance your statement to determine the righteousness happiness and prayer?
Let me see if I understand that. I was trying to suggest that if you look at the tradition of ethics that wants to say human beings should seek happiness, you find out two things real quickly. One, no one agrees on what happiness really is. John was sitting this in his lecture as well. And also we can imagine almost an indeterminate number of things one can pursue to be happy. Right? If one looks at what are, on the other side, if one looks at what one's duties and obligations are, depending on the tradition and so on, you can have a proliferation of duties and obligations. And so we'd have to start making distinctions. The history of ethics has oftentimes tried to define the human good, either, again as we heard it earlier today, reducing happiness to duty or duty to happiness. The argument I'm making is that this conception that the highest human good is a synthesis between happiness and duty meant to do two things. One, it avoids the reduction of the highest good either to happiness or only to duty, tries to see those related. But by relating them, it also renders more determinate the range of things we can seek in terms of real happiness and real operation. I mean, we live in a culture that is constantly proliferating more ways to supposedly be happy. So part of the problem in the moral life is how to get some determinate complexity. Is that getting to your question?
Thank you very much. I was struck by the absence of justice language or responsibility language, which for you and your past work has been a significant point. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more, elaborate a little more about where justice and responsibility would fit inside of this frame, and if this denotes a sort of, not departure, but perhaps further elaboration on previous decisions.
Yeah.
Justice with respect to responsibility?
Yeah, justice would come up in two ways. One, in terms of the political dimension, which I could only mention in terms of the kingdom of ends with Kant, or the spreading of what he calls gospel holiness across the land with someone like Wesley. But there would be place for a political conception of justice that would have to protect the human highest good, as defined here. Secondly, this notion of integrity is the integration or drawing together of basic goods into some complex interrelation of those could be seen itself as a substantive conception of justice. And what we mean by justice is just the right integration of goods, as well as their distribution. Responsibility for me is the form that the moral life should take. It's a discourse about power and how power is to be exercised. So when I ask in the lecture about, maybe this went over too quickly, does the power for attaining the human highest good rely within ourselves or within the divine or some combination thereof, that would be the point to start elaborating the notion of responsibility. So no, I don't want to give up on the notion of responsibility, quite the contrary. I was just pulling out a very specific problem within ethics on this. Clear as mud that covers the ground.
No, I was wondering if you would say a little bit more just on the question of power. I think during your lecture you said something about power in relation to the ability to integrate, and just found that very intriguing.
Yeah, I use a fairly flat-footed, I suppose, definition of power. For me, it is the capacity to create, respond to, or transform reality. It can take different forms in terms of its legitimation, such as power over one. But for me, power is simply the capacity to respond to, shape, or create realities. And so what I'm asking in the moral life, the problem is, what is the power we exercise as we respond to the world, attempt to shape our own lives, and create forms of living together? And the way to talk about that is through the notion of responsibility. Yeah. Thank you all very much for your patience.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.